In the darkest years of the Great Depression, when paychecks disappeared and cupboards ran bare, families across the country faced the unthinkable: how to keep their children fed with almost nothing at all. Today, we honor the mothers and fathers who turned scraps into suppers, crafting humble meals that carried their families through the storm. Dish 1. Hoover stew. It wasn't fancy, but it filled a plate and quieted a hungry stomach. And in the end, that's all anyone was asking for. Hoover stew was a meal born out of hard times and harder feelings. Named after President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for the economic collapse, this stew became a symbol of scraping by when the pantry seemed empty. It showed up in school lunchrooms, church basements, and relief kitchens, ladled into chipped bowls and tin plates, often accompanied by a grateful, if weary, smile. Imagine a pot bubbling on the stove, its scent wafting through a small kitchen where the walls are thin and the hope even thinner. Children sit at the table, their feet swinging, waiting for that ladle to hit their plate. What went into the pot depended on what you had, but it always followed the same principle: cheap, filling, and easy to stretch.
Way back to the 1930s, the Great Depression, Hoover stew, and it was also designed to feed a lot of people for not very much money.
You'd start with macaroni. Those little elbows or shells were the backbone of the dish, sturdy and reliable. Into the pot they'd go, boiled until tender. Next came the canned goods: stewed tomatoes, their sweet acid tang brightening the pot, canned corn or beans, adding a bit of texture and sweetness. And then the bit of protein, usually chopped up hot dogs or bologna, sometimes bits of leftover sausage if luck had been kind that week. Salt and pepper were the only seasonings most could spare, though if a neighbor shared a pinch of chili powder or paprika, you counted yourself blessed. To make it, you'd first boil the macaroni in salted water until just soft, then drain it, saving a bit of the pasta water in case the stew needed thinning. In a large pot, you'd warm the stewed tomatoes, tossing in the drained macaroni, the canned corn, and the sliced hot dogs. A good stir brought it all together, and you'd let it simmer until the flavors had a chance to mingle. Maybe 10 or 15 minutes, maybe a little longer if folks were still arriving at the table. Some cooks mashed a few of the beans or tomatoes to thicken the broth, while others liked it more like a chunky soup. The result was no showpiece, but it was hearty, warm, and, most importantly, it was enough. Enough to fill the bellies around the table, enough to make a mother feel like she'd provided, and enough to keep a family going for one more day. And sometimes, that was all the victory you needed. Dish 2. Cornmeal mush. There's a quiet kind of poetry in a dish as plain as cornmeal mush, a meal that asks so little yet gives so much. Cornmeal mush was a breakfast standby during the Great Depression, one that made its humble way to many a family table in those lean years. When mornings arrived cold and hard, and there was nothing but a bit of cornmeal rattling in a tin canister, mothers and grandmothers knew just what to do. They turned that golden meal into something warm, filling, and unexpectedly comforting. Cornmeal, after all, was one of the great survivors of the era. Cheap, shelf-stable, and often handed out in government relief packages, it became the backbone of many poor man meals.
We're going to go ahead and make something that maybe you've had recently, maybe you haven't had it in a long time. Either way, it's called cornmeal mush.
Families in rural Appalachia, across the Midwest, and even in city tenements, counted on it to stretch their meals, often recalling the same frugal wisdom their ancestors had passed down. To make cornmeal mush, you'd bring a pot of salted water to a boil, the steam curling up and warming cold kitchen walls. Slowly, always slowly, you'd trickle in the cornmeal, whisking constantly to keep the lumps at bay. The mixture would thicken and bubble, giving off an earthy, toasted scent that somehow promised a good day ahead. The key was patience, standing over the stove, stirring and stirring until the mush thickened into a soft, spoonable porridge. Once cooked, it was ladled into bowls and eaten warm, sometimes with a splash of milk, a pat of butter if you were lucky, or a drizzle of molasses for a touch of sweetness. Sugar was often a luxury, but many families made do with a sprinkle of salt, or, in truly hard times, ate it plain. What made cornmeal mush truly special, though, was its second life. Left to cool in a pan overnight, it firmed into a sturdy loaf. Come morning, it was sliced and fried in bacon grease or lard, crisping to a golden brown on the outside while staying soft within. Served alongside eggs, or even on its own, Fried mush became a breakfast treat that cost next to nothing, but tasted like a little indulgence. Cornmeal mush wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the stuff of cookbooks or grand tables, but it fed families through hard winters, carried workers into long days, and filled children's bellies before they walked miles to school. And in its simple, steadfast way, it reminded everyone around the table that sometimes the plainest meals leave the deepest mark. Dish 3, dandelion salad. Sometimes survival grew right under your feet, bright and bitter, defiant as a dandelion pushing through a cracked sidewalk. During the Great Depression, when store shelves emptied and garden rows ran thin, families turned to the land itself for sustenance. Foraging wasn't a trendy pastime or a charming hobby. It was a lifeline. And among the most common, though often overlooked, wild foods was the humble dandelion. What many today consider a weed was once a welcome source of nourishment, scattered across lawns, fields, and even along the dusty edges of country roads. Mothers and children would set out in the early morning with baskets, aprons, or tin pails, eyes scanning the earth for the tender young dandelion leaves before the sun turned them tough and bitter. It wasn't just about gathering food, it was about knowing the land, reading the seasons, and passing on the quiet wisdom of survival. Dandelion salad became a regular sight on Depression-era tables, offering a much-needed splash of green on plates, otherwise ruled by potatoes, beans, and bread. Its peppery bite woke up tired palates and added precious vitamins and minerals to diets worn thin by scarcity. The ingredients were disarmingly simple, yet full of possibility. You'd begin with a heaping pile of freshly picked dandelion greens, washed carefully in cold water, their stems trimmed and any limp or yellowed leaves discarded. If the household was lucky, thin slices of raw onion or a handful of chopped hard-boiled eggs were tossed in for a bit of extra richness. But the real star of the show was the dressing. A warm, tangy mix of bacon drippings, a splash of vinegar, and a pinch of salt and pepper. This modest concoction turned a bowl of weeds into something craveable. Making dandelion salad was a small act of alchemy. First, a bit of bacon or salt pork was fried up in a cast-iron skillet, the fat slowly rendering out until it shimmered and crackled. Into that fragrant grease went the vinegar, spitting and hissing as it hit the pan, followed by a grind of black pepper and a good pinch of salt. The clean greens were piled into a waiting bowl, and the hot dressing was poured right over them, wilting the leaves just enough to mellow their edge. A quick toss with a big wooden spoon, and the salad was ready for the table. This was a dish of contrasts, bitter and salty, sharp and soft, humble and proud. It tethered families, not just to the land, but to generations past, to grandmothers and great-grandmothers who had foraged those same greens long before hard times arrived. Dandelion salad reminded families that resilience sometimes grows in the most unlikely places, and that even in the leanest times, nature quietly offers its gifts. Dish 4, potato pancakes. There's a certain magic to the scent of frying potatoes, the way it drifts through a house, calling children from porches, drawing neighbors to open windows, promising something crisp, golden, and irresistible. In Depression-era kitchens, potatoes were nothing short of a blessing. Cheap, filling, and endlessly versatile, they showed up on tables morning, noon, and night. You could boil them, mash them, roast them, or tuck them into stews, but few preparations were as beloved or as satisfying as potato pancakes. Crisp at the edges, tender in the middle, and kissed with just enough salt, they transformed the humblest of ingredients into a dish that felt almost like a celebration. The roots of potato pancakes stretch back centuries, brought to America by Eastern European immigrants who had long known how to stretch a sack of spuds through long winters. But during the Great Depression, this old-world peasant dish became a near-universal staple, gracing the tables of city tenements, prairie farmhouses, and Appalachian cabins alike. The recipe was beautifully frugal, built on what nearly every kitchen had. You'd start with potatoes, usually grated by hand on a box grater, until your arms ached and your knuckles bore the scrape marks of hard work. The grated mass was then bundled into a clean cloth or dish towel and wrung out with determination, twisting until the water ran free, an essential step to achieving that coveted crisp edge. Into the bowl went a minced onion, a dusting of flour, a pinch of salt, and, if fortune allowed, a single egg to help bind it all together. Cooking was as much performance as process. A heavy cast-iron skillet was set on the stove, a generous spoonful of lard or bacon grease dropped in to melt and shimmer. Spoonfuls of batter were then dropped into the hot pan, flattening into rustic rounds as they hit the heat. The sound of sizzling filled the kitchen, a siren call for anyone within earshot. You'd flip them once, maybe twice, coaxing both sides into a glorious golden brown, the smell filling every room in the house. There was no fuss in serving them, just a stack on a well-worn plate, maybe a dusting of salt or, if you were lucky, a dab of applesauce or a spoonful of sour cream. But the joy they brought was immeasurable. For children, they were a treat. For parents, a small victory. A reminder that even when money was scarce, a bit of ingenuity and a hot skillet could bring comfort, laughter, and a full table. Potato pancakes weren't just a meal. They were a moment of triumph in hard times, a simple reminder that good food doesn't need riches, just care, creativity, and the will to make something from almost nothing. Dish 5. Navy bean soup. Some meals don't shout. They whisper, slow and steady, promising warmth and comfort with every ladleful. Navy bean soup was one of those quiet heroes in Depression-era kitchens, simmering on stoves from coast to coast and feeding families through some of their hardest days. Named for its long history of nourishing sailors in the U.S. Navy on lengthy sea voyages, the humble Navy bean became the backbone of many home kitchens when paychecks dried up and grocery lists were pared to the bone. With just a handful of pantry staples and a bit of patience, families could fill a pot with something hearty, wholesome, and, if you had a ham bone or salt pork tucked away, even downright delicious. Picture a heavy pot perched on the back of a wood stove, its lid rattling softly as beans and broth bubble inside, sending up little wisps of steam that fog the kitchen windows. The aroma was gentle, but unmistakable. The earthy sweetness of navy beans, the mellow fragrance of onions and carrots softening in the pot, and, when luck allowed, the faint smokiness of a pork scrap or ham bone nestled among the vegetables. It was the kind of meal that fed you twice, once with its warmth, and again with the comfort it brought to the spirit. The preparation began the night before. A cup or two of dried navy beans were rinsed clean and left to soak overnight in a big bowl of water, softening for the long simmer ahead. Come morning, the beans were drained and tumbled into a soup pot, joined by chopped onions, diced carrots, maybe a rib of celery if one was available, and the prized addition of a ham bone or chunk of salt pork. Water was poured in until everything was covered, and if the household was especially fortunate, a bay leaf might be tossed into the pot, a fragrant little luxury saved from past meals. The pot was brought to a gentle boil, then lowered to a lazy simmer, the kind of cooking that invited patience and trust. Hours slipped by as the beans swelled and softened, the broth thickened, and the flavors melded into something far greater than the sum of their parts. Some cooks like to mash a ladleful of beans against the side of the pot, giving the soup a creamier texture. Others left it brothy and light, almost like a stew. When it was ready, the soup was ladled into bowls, often topped with a sprinkle of black pepper or, in some homes, a drizzle of vinegar for a bright finishing touch. A heel of bread or a crumbly biscuit on the side completed the meal, no extra fuss required. Navy bean soup wasn't about flash or flair, it was about care. It was about making the most of what little you had, about filling the house with a scent that quietly promised, "We'll get through this." And more often than not, that message was every bit as nourishing as the soup itself. Dish 6, milk toast. It was the simplest of comforts, a soft landing on a hard day, a quiet reminder that even the barest cupboard could yield something tender and kind. Milk toast was the very picture of humble nourishment during the Great Depression. It was a dish often served to children, the sick, or the elderly, not because it was indulgent or fancy, but because it was gentle, easy to digest, and familiar in a world that was anything but. You could call it poor man's pudding, or you could call it what it was, a warm hug in a bowl, a little bowl full of solace at the end of a long, hard day. Though milk toast flourished in the 1930s, its roots stretched back much further, all the way to colonial America, when thrifty cooks learned to waste nothing and stretch everything. By the Depression, bread was a precious resource, and no slice was ever taken for granted. Without preservatives, loaves went stale quickly, but that was no problem. Day-old or even slightly dry bread was perfect for milk toast. And milk, when you had it, was a treasure in its own right, capable of turning the simplest scraps into something that felt abundant and generous. The preparation was as straightforward as it gets, but it carried a certain quiet ritual. You'd start by toasting slices of bread, not just lightly, but thoroughly, so they would stand up to the hot milk without falling to pieces too soon. This was often done in the oven, over a stovetop burner, or even near a coal fire, with watchful eyes making sure it didn't burn. The goal wasn't some perfect golden color. It was resilience, just enough crispness to give the dish body. Meanwhile, milk was warmed in a saucepan, sometimes with a bit of sugar if there was any to spare. A pinch of salt was added, and if the pantry offered the rare gift of spices, a dusting of cinnamon or nutmeg would turn the pot into something almost festive. Butter, when available, was saved for the very last step, a crowning touch that felt almost indulgent. To serve, the toast was laid in a shallow bowl, and the hot, sweetened milk was poured over, soaking the bread until it softened into something spoonable and comforting. A pat of butter melting on top turned it into pure luxury, at least by Depression-era standards. For children, milk toast softened the edge of hardship. For the elderly, it was kind to tired bodies. And for weary parents, it was a small but meaningful triumph to put something warm, sweet, and nourishing on the table when times were hardest. Milk toast didn't need to be glamorous. Its power was in its simplicity, a quiet act of love that reminded families that even in the leanest times, there was still room for comfort. Dish 7. Fried cabbage and noodles. Sometimes all it took was a skillet and a little cabbage to turn dinner time from hardship into happiness. Fried cabbage and noodles was a dish born of thrift, but it tasted like celebration. Rooted in the traditions of Eastern European immigrants, it crossed the ocean and made its way into American kitchens, where families learned to stretch a dollar as far as it could possibly go. By the time the Great Depression hit, this simple, hearty meal had become a staple on tables from Pennsylvania mining towns to Midwestern farmhouses, offering comfort and nourishment when little else could. The magic of this dish wasn't just in the eating, it was in the making. Picture the rhythm of it, the soft thud of a knife chopping cabbage into thin ribbons, the hiss and pop as it hit a hot skillet slicked with bacon grease or lard, the steady burble of noodles boiling on the back burner. There was a kind of homey music to it, a familiar cadence that filled the kitchen with warmth long before anyone took their first bite. The ingredients were humble but steadfast. A small head of green cabbage, sliced as thin as patience allowed, a yellow onion, chopped fine, a heap of wide egg noodles, sometimes homemade from scratch, sometimes bought in bulk at the local grocer. The fat came from whatever could be spared. Bacon drippings saved from breakfast, a spoonful of lard from the tin by the stove, or on fortunate days, a dab of butter. Seasonings were kept simple. Salt and black pepper were the backbone, though a pinch of paprika or caraway seeds sometimes found their way into the pan when a cook wanted to fancy things up. The process was simple but satisfying. First, the noodles were boiled until tender and set aside. In a heavy skillet, the fat was heated until it shimmered, and in went the onions and cabbage, sizzling and softening until the cabbage wilted and caramelized at the edges. The noodles were tossed in last, stirred and flipped until they were coated in savory fat, flecked with sweet bits of cabbage and onion, and kissed with salt and pepper. There was no mistaking the smell, rich, nutty, slightly sweet, and it had a way of drawing people toward the kitchen, eager for a taste. Served in generous bowls, often with nothing more than a bit of bread on the side, fried cabbage and noodles filled bellies and lifted weary spirits. In a time when thrift ruled the table, this dish stood as a gentle reminder that frugality and flavor could go hand in hand, and that sometimes the simplest meals were the ones that left the deepest mark. Dish 8. Depression-era chocolate cake. Sometimes, when the world outside felt gray and heavy, a little slice of chocolate cake was all it took to remind a family that sweetness still had a place at the table. Known affectionately as wacky cake or crazy cake, this Depression-era chocolate cake was nothing short of a small miracle born straight out of scarcity. With no eggs, no butter, and no milk, it defied all odds, rising tall and tender from the oven, as though it were thumbing its nose at the hard times outside the kitchen window. Across America, families turned to this remarkable recipe when they wanted to mark a birthday, lift sagging spirits, or simply enjoy a little indulgence without upsetting their meager household budget. The magic of this cake was in its elegant simplicity. The dry ingredients, flour, sugar, cocoa powder, baking soda, and a pinch of salt, were whisked together right in the baking pan. There was no need for fancy bowls or electric mixers, no need for eggs or butter or cream, just a wooden spoon and a sturdy arm. Then came the wet ingredients: vegetable oil, or melted shortening if that's all you had, vinegar, water, and a splash of vanilla. When the vinegar met the baking soda, it sparked a bubbling reaction that lightened the batter and lifted the cake. No eggs needed, no fuss required. To make it, the flour, sugar, cocoa, baking soda, and salt were sifted directly into a greased pan, the surface smoothed with the back of a spoon. 3 little wells were poked into the dry mix, one for the oil, one for the vinegar, and one for the vanilla extract. Water was poured over everything, and the batter was stirred until smooth and lump-free. It was a ritual that often felt almost playful, with children eagerly helping to poke the wells, their fingertips dusted in flour and cocoa. Into a moderate oven it went, where the batter transformed into a moist, chocolate-scented cake that filled the entire house with the most glorious aroma. Once baked, it was set to cool on a windowsill or the back stoop, a temptation to every child within sniffing distance. If a sprinkle of powdered sugar, a drizzle of syrup, or a smear of jam was available for the top, all the better, but even plain, it was a treasure. This cake was more than just dessert. It was a quiet declaration of hope. It reminded families that even in the hardest times, a little creativity and a bit of cocoa could lift hearts and make a house feel like home, if only for a few sweet and fleeting moments. Dish 9, cabbage soup. It was the kind of soup that stretched and stretched, filling the house with the scent of something simmering, even when the cupboard offered almost nothing at all. Cabbage soup was a true lifeline in many Depression-era households, a dish that made something from nearly nothing and left no one hungry at the end of the day. In a world where every penny mattered and waste was unthinkable, cabbage was a cook's best friend. It was cheap, filling, and hearty enough to last in the root cellar for weeks. And when simmered into soup, it transformed into a meal that warmed both body and spirit. The beauty of cabbage soup lay in its adaptability, its ability to welcome whatever scraps and odds and ends were on hand. There was no fixed recipe, just a rhythm and instinct passed down through generations. You'd begin with a pot of water, sometimes plain, sometimes boosted, with a scrap of meat, a ham bone, or even just a crumbled bouillon cube if that's all the pantry allowed. Into that pot went cabbage, chopped into rustic chunks, its crinkly green leaves softening as they cooked. Alongside it were whatever vegetables you had: carrots, onions, potatoes, and occasionally a stalk or two of celery. The soup pot didn't judge, it welcomed whatever needed using up. The process was slow and steady, demanding patience, but rewarding it generously. As the cabbage simmered, it sweetened, softening into silky ribbons that floated through the pot. The carrots lent their gentle earthiness, the potatoes gave a little body and starch, and if a ham bone had been tucked in, it worked its quiet magic, sending smoky whispers through the broth. Some home cooks added a handful of barley or rice to stretch the meal even further, transforming it into a stew that could last for days, filling not just plates, but lunch pails. Making cabbage soup was as much about care as it was about ingredients. The pot would come to a gentle boil before the heat was lowered, the soup left to burble away on the back burner. Steam fogged up the kitchen windows, and the scent filled the house with a promise of comfort. Mothers would dip a spoon in now and then, tasting for salt, maybe adding a pinch of pepper or a splash of vinegar to brighten the flavor at the end. When ladled into bowls, cabbage soup was humble but deeply satisfying. Paired with a thick slice of bread or a simple biscuit, it offered not just nourishment, but a kind of quiet reassurance. There was always enough for one more bowl, always enough to carry the family through one more day. In those lean years, cabbage soup wasn't just a meal. It was a symbol of resilience, of making do, and of gathering around the table to share not just food, but hope. Dish 10, onion sandwiches. Sometimes, survival came between 2 slices of bread, sharp, humble, and honest as an onion. Onion sandwiches were as bare bones a meal as you could find during the Great Depression, yet they carried with them a quiet dignity. When meat was a luxury, cheese was scarce, and even peanut butter was too precious to spread. Families turned to one of the cheapest, most accessible ingredients they had, the onion. Pungent, sharp, and unapologetically bold, it was a vegetable that pulled no punches, delivering a jolt of flavor that transformed plain bread into something that almost felt like a meal. For many working families, coal miners, factory hands, farm laborers, onion sandwiches were a staple packed into lunch pails. They were simple, quick to assemble, and sturdy enough to survive a long day's work. But beyond that, they were a symbol of resilience, of finding a way to fill a belly when the cupboard offered little more than a bag of flour and a sack of onions. The ingredients were about as humble as it gets: 2 slices of bread, a smear of butter or lard if it was on hand, thinly sliced raw onions, and a sprinkle of salt. Some families, if they were lucky, might add a bit of mustard or a splash of vinegar to tame the onion's bite. But in most homes, the sandwich stayed simple, relying on the onion's natural pungency and the richness of the fat to carry the flavor. Preparing an onion sandwich was straightforward, but required a little care. The onions were peeled and sliced thin, often while holding back tears as their sharp aroma filled the kitchen. The bread, homemade or store-bought, often a bit stale, was spread with butter or lard to soften the bite and add a little fat. The onion slices were laid on generously, sometimes overlapped into a thick stack, then lightly salted before being pressed between the bread. Biting into an onion sandwich was an experience of contrasts: the crunch and heat of the onion, the soft chew of the bread, the creamy or savory smear of fat. It was bold and unapologetic, a meal that filled the belly when nothing else was available. For children, it was sometimes a learned taste. For adults, it was a familiar companion through hard days. Onion sandwiches weren't just about getting by. They were about making the most of what you had, about honoring every scrap in the pantry, and about the quiet triumph of sitting down to a meal, however humble, and carrying on. Dish 11. Chipped beef. Gravy on toast. It went by many names: chipped beef on toast, creamed beef, or, in military slang, SOS. But no matter what you called it, it was a dish that filled bellies and kept families going when times were lean. Chipped beef gravy on toast was a Depression-era staple that crossed from army mess halls into home kitchens with ease. Originally designed to feed hungry soldiers on a shoestring budget, it became just as beloved in households across America, where stretching a meal was not just a habit, but a necessity. This humble dish took scraps of dried beef and turned them into something that felt hearty, creamy, and deeply comforting, a kind of poor man's luxury. The backbone of the dish was thin, salty slices of dried beef. Often sold in small glass jars or wrapped in paper at the butcher's counter, chipped beef was cheap, lasted forever in the pantry, and packed a punch of flavor. It was a lifesaver when meat was out of reach and protein was needed to fuel the day. The preparation was beautifully simple. The dried beef was first chopped or torn into small pieces, sometimes soaked briefly in warm water to mellow its saltiness. In a skillet, butter, lard, or bacon grease was melted, and then flour was whisked in to make a roux, the golden backbone of countless Depression-era gravies. Slowly, milk was added, stirred constantly until the sauce thickened into a creamy base. Finally, the chipped beef was folded in, infusing the gravy with its unmistakable savory depth. Meanwhile, slices of bread were toasted, white bread if it was available, day-old biscuits or cornbread if that's what the pantry offered. The toast was placed on plates, and then came the best part: ladling the steaming, creamy chipped beef gravy over the top until it soaked into the bread, softening it underneath, while the top stayed beautifully messy. For many families, this dish was a workhorse meal, showing up at breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It was rich enough to feel special, but cheap enough to serve often, and a sprinkle of black pepper or a dash of paprika gave it an extra spark when the spice jar still had something left to offer. Chipped beef on toast wasn't about elegance. It was about resourcefulness, comfort, and making something satisfying out of the simplest ingredients. It filled plates, warmed hearts, and reminded families that even in the toughest times, you could still gather around the table for a hot, nourishing meal. Dish 12. Peanut butter bread. In a time when scarcity ruled the day, few things felt more miraculous than pulling a warm loaf of peanut butter bread from the oven. Simple, fragrant, and packed with the kind of nourishment that carried families through lean times. Peanut butter bread became a quiet hero in Depression-era kitchens, a recipe that worked its way into countless homes thanks to its thrift, simplicity, and surprisingly rich flavor. With no eggs, no yeast, and no need for fancy equipment, this loaf was a symbol of ingenuity, turning just a handful of pantry staples into something that felt almost indulgent. Peanut butter itself was a Depression-era marvel. Once considered a specialty food, it became widely available and affordable in the 1920s and 30s, prized not just for its flavor, but for its protein and shelf stability. Families quickly discovered that peanut butter could stretch beyond sandwiches and spoonfuls. It could become the very heart of a loaf of bread. The ingredients were as humble as they come: flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, sugar if it was available, milk or watered-down evaporated milk, and of course, peanut butter. Some households added a splash of vanilla or a bit of melted shortening for extra tenderness, but even without those small luxuries, the bread baked up beautifully. Making peanut butter bread was a simple but comforting ritual. The dry ingredients were whisked together: flour, baking powder, salt, and sugar. In a separate bowl, the peanut butter was mixed with milk until smooth, and then it was gently folded into the dry mix, creating a thick, nutty batter. It was scraped into a greased loaf pan, the top smoothed with the back of a spoon, and then slid into a modest oven where it baked into golden brown perfection. The smell that filled the kitchen was enough to draw every child to the stove, noses lifted, eyes wide with anticipation. Once baked and cooled just slightly, the loaf was sliced into thick, tender pieces. It was delicious on its own, but a spread of jam, a drizzle of honey, or even another swipe of peanut butter turned it into something that felt downright decadent. Peanut butter bread was more than a recipe. It was a small victory on the home front, a way for families to create something nourishing and joyful in the face of hardship. It offered not just calories, but comfort, not just sustenance, but a sweet reminder that even in hard times, there was still room at the table for a little warmth and delight. Dish 13, eggless pancakes. There's something undeniably comforting about the sound of batter hitting a hot griddle, the soft sizzle, the gentle rise, the familiar scent that drifts through the house, promising a breakfast that brings everyone to the table. During the Great Depression, eggs were often a luxury many families couldn't afford. Yet that didn't stop home cooks from whipping up a stack of fluffy golden pancakes that could feed a hungry household. Eggless pancakes became a breakfast mainstay across America, offering a thrifty but satisfying start to the day. They were a reminder that even when times were tough, a warm meal could still feel like a small celebration. The ingredients were simple and accessible: flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, a little sugar if it was on hand, and either water, milk, or even watered-down evaporated milk to bring it all together. A spoonful of fat, usually lard, bacon grease, or a drizzle of vegetable oil, gave the batter just enough richness to crisp up on the griddle. Without eggs, it was the baking powder that worked its magic, lifting the pancakes into light, tender rounds. Making eggless pancakes was a joyful ritual in many households. Into a large bowl went the dry ingredients: flour, salt, baking powder, and sugar, whisked together to break up any lumps. Then the wet ingredients were poured in, and the batter stirred until just combined, thick and slightly lumpy. A heavy skillet or griddle was set over the fire, greased with a thin layer of fat until it shimmered, ready to receive ladlefuls of batter. Each pancake bubbled and puffed as it cooked, the surface speckled with tiny holes that signaled it was time to flip. There was something deeply satisfying about turning them over, revealing a beautifully browned underside, crisp at the edges and soft in the middle. They were stacked high on chipped plates, sometimes eaten plain, sometimes spread with a dab of butter or lard, and often drizzled with syrup, molasses, or a sprinkle of sugar if the pantry allowed. For children, eggless pancakes were a treat that softened the hardship of the times. For parents, they were a practical way to stretch the food budget while still offering something warm, familiar, and nourishing. They turned a handful of basic ingredients into a meal that felt generous, filling bellies and lifting spirits in equal measure. Eggless pancakes were more than just breakfast. They were a testament to resourcefulness, a lesson in making do, and a quiet reminder that even in lean years, a stack of golden rounds on the breakfast table could bring a little joy to the start of the day. Dish 14, mock apple pie. When the orchard was bare and the pantry held no fruit, home cooks reached for the unlikeliest of ingredients, and out of a handful of crackers, they baked a pie that tasted like hope. Mock apple pie is one of the most remarkable and charming recipes to come out of the Great Depression. Created out of necessity, it delivered the sweet, tart satisfaction of apple pie without using a single apple. Instead, home bakers turned to Ritz crackers or saltines, along with sugar, cinnamon, and a splash of lemon juice, to mimic the taste and texture of baked fruit. It was a little culinary sleight of hand that became both a practical solution and a beloved family trick. At a time when apples were either out of season or too expensive for many families to buy, the desire to preserve familiar comforts, especially for holidays or special occasions, led to ingenious substitutions. Crackers were cheap, shelf-stable, and already a pantry staple, and when softened in a sweet-spiced syrup and baked inside a flaky crust, they transformed into something surprisingly close to the real thing. The making of mock apple pie was a small domestic drama. First, a simple syrup was prepared on the stove by combining water, sugar, and a splash of lemon juice, bringing it to a boil and then simmering until it thickened slightly. The scent of cinnamon or nutmeg added to the pot filled the kitchen with that unmistakable pie aroma, teasing the senses and lifting spirits. Meanwhile, the pie crust was rolled out, often from scratch using flour, lard, and a bit of water, lined into a tin and sprinkled with broken crackers. The hot syrup was poured over the crackers, softening them until they took on the tender, layered texture of baked apples. A top crust was carefully fitted over, crimped along the edges, and cut with a few slits to let the steam escape. Into the oven it went, where the magic unfolded. The syrup thickened, the crackers softened, and the crust turned golden and crisp. When sliced, the pie revealed its secret. No apples, just the glistening, spiced filling that fooled the tongue and delighted the crowd. Served plain or with a dollop of whipped cream, it was a dish that brought smiles to the table and reminded families that resourcefulness could still deliver sweetness. Mock apple pie wasn't just a dessert, it was a symbol of determination, a way of reclaiming joy when the world seemed to offer none. It taught families that with creativity and a bit of trust, even a box of crackers could become a slice of happiness. Dish 15, liver and onions. There's a certain bravery in the kitchen, a willingness to work with what you have, even when it's not everyone's favorite. Liver and onions was that kind of meal, bold, unapologetic, and surprisingly beloved at many Depression-era tables. In an era when families counted every penny and no part of an animal went to waste, liver was a prized source of protein. It was inexpensive, packed with iron, and available at nearly every butcher shop. For working-class families, it was a way to put meat on the table without blowing the week's grocery budget. When fried up with sweet, caramelized onions, liver transformed from something humble and a bit intimidating into a dish full of rich, earthy flavor and heartiness. The preparation was straightforward, but called for a gentle hand. First, the liver, usually beef or calf liver, was sliced into thin strips, soaked in milk or salted water if possible, to help soften its sharp taste and tenderize the texture. While the liver rested, onions were peeled and sliced into half moons, ready to turn golden in the pan. A heavy skillet was set over the flame, often slicked with bacon grease or lard, saved from other meals. The onions went in first, sizzling and softening, their sugars slowly coaxed to the surface as they browned and sweetened. Once the onions were meltingly tender, they were scooped out and set aside, making room in the pan for the liver. The liver was dredged lightly in flour, seasoned with salt and pepper, and laid carefully into the hot fat. It needed only a few minutes per side, just enough to brown the edges while keeping the inside soft. Overcooked liver could turn tough in an instant, and Depression-era cooks knew well how to get the most out of every scrap. Once the liver was cooked, the onions were piled back on top, soaking up the pan juices and mingling their sweetness with the deep, minerally richness of the meat. Served with mashed potatoes or a simple hunk of bread, liver and onions was a meal that packed a punch. It wasn't meant to be delicate or refined. It was meant to nourish, to strengthen, to stretch the family budget without sacrificing flavor. For many who grew up in those years, liver and onions became a symbol of endurance, a dish that asked you to embrace life's tougher cuts and with a little care and a hot skillet, turn them into something worthy of the dinner table. Dish 16, macaroni and tomatoes. It was a dish as simple as a summer breeze, yet it carried the weight of hard times, humble, hearty, and quietly loved, across countless Depression-era kitchens. Macaroni and tomatoes was one of those meals that could turn a handful of pantry staples into something warm and filling. In an era when meat was rare and vegetables were often home-canned, families leaned on pasta and tomatoes to get through the lean days. With a pot of this on the stove, there was always something to put on the table, and sometimes that was all the comfort a family needed. The backbone of the dish was elbow macaroni or any other small pasta a family could afford. Cheap, filling, and easy to store. The tomatoes came canned if you were lucky, or home preserved in jars if you were resourceful. Sometimes they were whole, sometimes crushed, sometimes little more than juice and seeds. But no matter the form, they were the heart of the meal. Making macaroni and tomatoes was as straightforward as it gets. First, a pot of salted water was set to boil, and the macaroni tumbled in, stirring now and then to keep it from sticking. As the pasta softened, a separate pot was set over the flame, where the canned tomatoes were warmed, often with a knob of butter or a drizzle of lard, depending on what was on hand. Salt and pepper were the basic seasonings, but some cooks liked to toss in a pinch of sugar to balance the acidity, or a sprinkle of dried herbs if the garden had been kind. Once the pasta was drained, it was stirred straight into the simmering tomatoes, where it soaked up the tangy, slightly sweet sauce. Some families kept it brothy, like a thin stew. Others let it cook down until the sauce clung to each piece of macaroni. On really lean nights, the pot was thinned with water to make it stretch a little farther. Served in big bowls, often with a piece of cornbread or a biscuit on the side, macaroni and tomatoes offered more than just nourishment. It offered a taste of comfort, a reminder that even in hard times, a warm, familiar meal could bring people together around the table. It wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. It was a bowl full of survival, flavored with hope and a little bit of home. Dish 17, tomato gravy over biscuits. In a world where meat was scarce and butter was precious,
tomato gravy. Now,
tomato gravy over biscuits was proof that you could still bring something rich and satisfying to the table without breaking the bank. This Southern classic found its way onto Depression-era tables across the country, especially in rural areas where families clung to tradition and resourcefulness. Tomato gravy wasn't a gravy in the meaty brown sauce sense. It was a silky, savory sweet sauce made from stewed or canned tomatoes, thickened with a bit of flour and fat, and poured generously over hot, flaky biscuits. It was the sort of meal that could stretch a garden's bounty or a pantry's last few cans into something that felt like a feast. The ingredients were charmingly simple. You'd begin with lard or bacon grease, saved carefully from breakfast past, melted down in a cast iron skillet. Into that shimmering fat went a spoonful of flour, whisked together to make a roux, the backbone of so many Depression-era gravies. Once the flour browned slightly, in went the tomatoes. Canned, stewed tomatoes, crushed by hand, or even fresh ones peeled and chopped when the garden was generous. As the gravy bubbled and thickened, a sprinkle of salt, pepper, and sometimes a pinch of sugar balanced the sharpness of the tomatoes. Some cooks tossed in a bit of onion or a splash of milk if it was handy, but the heart of the dish was always the marriage of tomatoes, fat, and flour. The smell was unmistakable, savory, tangy, and just a little smoky if bacon grease was involved. Meanwhile, the biscuits were prepared. Quick, no-nonsense biscuits made from flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, and maybe a splash of milk or water. Rolled out and cut into rounds, they were baked until golden, their tops crisp and bottoms tender. If the day called for shortcuts, day-old biscuits were revived in the oven or a skillet. At the table, the biscuits were split open and smothered in the warm, velvety gravy. The biscuits soaked up the sauce like sponges, turning crumbly interiors into soft, tomatoey bites that melted in the mouth. It was a meal that didn't apologize for its simplicity, it reveled in it. Tomato gravy over biscuits was a celebration of making do, of transforming a handful of humble ingredients into something that tasted like abundance. It was, and still is, a dish that tastes like resilience. Dish 18, creamed corn on toast. Sometimes, the simplest meals are the ones that wrap around your memory like a warm blanket.
Making cream-style corn to go with dinner. And I have 4.
And creamed corn on toast was just that kind of meal during the Depression. When money was tight and shelves were bare, families turned to canned vegetables and pantry staples to fill hungry bellies. Creamed corn on toast was one of the most beloved of these poor man dishes, a quick, hearty meal that made something out of almost nothing. Sweet, creamy, and spooned over crisp, buttery toast, it brought comfort to breakfast, lunch, or supper tables alike. The magic of the dish lay in its few ingredients. A can of creamed corn, sometimes homemade from garden corn, scraped from the cob and simmered with milk, was the heart of it. Butter or lard, a little flour, and some milk or evaporated milk rounded out the sauce. Toast, often made from slightly stale bread, became the stage that lifted this humble sauce into something people craved. To prepare it, you'd start by melting a bit of butter or lard in a pan. A spoonful of flour was whisked in to make a light roux, giving the finished dish a bit more body and richness. The creamed corn was stirred in next, along with a splash of milk if it needed thinning. As it gently bubbled, it thickened into a silky, golden sauce, flecked with soft kernels of sweet corn, a pinch of salt and pepper, and, if fortune smiled, a sprinkle of sugar or a dusting of paprika brought everything together. Meanwhile, slices of bread were toasted until crisp, sometimes in a toaster, but more often in the oven or on a griddle, brushed with a little bacon grease if butter was scarce. The toast was laid out on plates, and the hot, creamy corn was poured generously over the top, soaking into every crack and crevice. Served with a side of canned peaches or stewed apples, or just on its own, creamed corn on toast was the kind of meal that might not have looked like much, but it filled a house with the scent of care and made a table feel abundant. For children, it was a treat. For parents, it was a small victory, proof that even in hard times, you could serve up something warm, sweet, and satisfying. Dish 19. Oatmeal with lard drippings. When mornings were cold and pockets were empty, a steaming bowl of oatmeal with lard drippings was the kind of breakfast that kept you on your feet.
Make the perfect bowl of creamy, thick, and rich oatmeal in your microwave. I am also going to share with you
and reminded you that thrift and warmth could share the same spoon. Oatmeal was a Depression-era breakfast staple, as familiar on farm tables as it was in city kitchens. Cheap, nourishing, and endlessly adaptable, it filled bowls across the country when there was little else to put on the table. But when butter and sugar were out of reach, and they often were, families turned to something a little unexpected: lard drippings. Lard was the precious byproduct of rendered pork fat, saved carefully in coffee tins or mason jars perched near the stove. Every spoonful was liquid gold to a Depression-era cook, used to grease pans, flavor vegetables, and, yes, enrich a pot of oats. Lard drippings, often flecked with salty bits of bacon or pork, gave oatmeal a savory richness that turned a plain porridge into a meal that stuck to your ribs. The preparation was straightforward, but deeply satisfying. Rolled oats were simmered in water, or, on luckier days, in milk, until they softened into a thick, creamy porridge. A pinch of salt brought out the oats' natural nuttiness. Meanwhile, the lard drippings were warmed gently, ready to be spooned over the finished bowl like a rustic sauce. Once ladled into bowls, the oatmeal was topped with a generous drizzle of the warm drippings. The fat soaked into the oats, pooling in little golden rivulets across the surface. Some folks added a sprinkle of salt, or even a pinch of black pepper, leaning fully into the savory side of breakfast. For families with a bit of sorghum or molasses tucked away, a thin ribbon of sweetness might join the mix, dancing between salty and sweet. The first spoonful was always a surprise, the oats soft and creamy, the lard bringing an unexpected depth and heartiness. For children, it was a learned taste, but for hardworking parents and grandparents, it was a reminder that food didn't need to be fancy to be filling. Oatmeal with lard drippings wasn't just about nourishment, it was about resilience. It taught a generation to find satisfaction in simplicity, to honor every scrap, and to approach the breakfast table not with complaint, but with quiet gratitude. Dish 20. Potato soup. There's a quiet kind of magic in a pot of potato soup, the way it can stretch to feed an unexpected guest, the way its simple scent can make a house feel like a home. Potato soup was a Depression-era favorite, a dish that showed just how far a few humble spuds could go. In a world where meat was a luxury and vegetables came from the backyard garden, potatoes were the great equalizer. Cheap, filling, and available year-round, they formed the backbone of countless meals. But in soup, they truly shined. The recipe varied from kitchen to kitchen, shaped by whatever was on hand. At its simplest, it was just potatoes, water, and a bit of salt. But even that could be transformed into something warming and nourishing with a little care. Many cooks would add onion for sweetness, carrot or celery if available, or a splash of milk or evaporated milk to add body and richness. If a ham bone or piece of salt pork was hanging around, it would be tossed in to lend its smoky magic to the broth. The process began with peeling and chopping the potatoes into rustic chunks, then setting them to boil in a big pot of water with a pinch of salt. As they softened, the starchy water turned milky and thick, forming the base of the soup. Onions or carrots were often sautéed in a spoonful of lard or bacon grease and added to the pot, layering in sweetness and depth. If milk was on hand, it was stirred in near the end, turning the soup pale and velvety. Some cooks mashed part of the potatoes against the side of the pot to thicken the soup, while others left them in tender chunks, a grind of black pepper on top, maybe a sprinkle of fresh herbs if the garden hadn't yet withered. Finished the dish with a flourish. Served in big bowls with a hunk of bread or a biscuit, potato soup was the kind of meal that made you feel cared for. It was there on cold nights, on tired afternoons, and on days when money was tight, but love was abundant. In the hardest times, a pot of potato soup was more than just food. It was an act of comfort, a promise that no matter how little you had, you could still gather around the table and share something warm and good. Dish 21. Boiled dinner. There's a kind of poetry in a one-pot meal, simple ingredients tossed together, simmered low and slow, each flavor lending itself to the next, until the whole becomes something greater than its humble parts. Boiled dinner was the workhorse of Depression-era kitchens, especially in rural homes where garden plots and backyard chickens were the safety net. It was less a recipe and more a ritual. Gather what you had, throw it into a pot, and let time and heat do the rest. With a backbone of root vegetables and maybe a scrap of meat or bone, boiled dinner filled the belly and warmed the soul. At its heart, boiled dinner was all about thrift. Cabbage, potatoes, carrots, onions, and turnips often formed the core, with parsnips or rutabagas joining the mix when available. If the family had a ham hock, salt pork, or a leftover beef bone, that went in too, infusing the broth with richness. But even without meat, the vegetables alone, slow-cooked and tender, made a hearty and nourishing meal. To make it, a big pot was filled with water, and in went the meat or bone to start the broth. It was brought to a boil, then lowered to a gentle simmer, the kitchen slowly filling with a savory scent. Once the broth had time to develop, an hour or two depending on the toughness of the meat, the chopped vegetables were added. Potatoes were left in large chunks so they wouldn't fall apart. Cabbage was cut into wedges, its layers softening as they cooked. The pot was left to simmer until the vegetables were tender and the flavors mingled beautifully. Salt and pepper were the usual seasonings, though some cooks added a splash of vinegar or a spoonful of prepared mustard on the side for brightness. Once ready, the meat was pulled from the pot, sliced thin if there was enough to go around, and the vegetables were ladled onto plates alongside it, bathed in a bit of the rich broth. Boiled dinner was a celebration of economy and abundance at once. It taught families to waste nothing, to make every scrap count, and to transform the most ordinary ingredients into a feast that could bring people together. Around those tables, with steam curling up from well-worn plates, there was no mistaking it. Boiled dinner wasn't just about getting by, it was about getting through together. Dish 22. Goulash. Some dishes are more than just a meal. They're a gathering in a pot, a mix of memories, comfort, and whatever you could scrounge from the pantry. Goulash was just that sort of dish during the Great Depression. Borrowed from Hungarian immigrant kitchens and adapted to fit American budgets, this humble stew of macaroni, ground beef, tomatoes, and spices became a mainstay in homes that needed every meal to stretch a little farther.
Today we're making goulash, Hungarian goulash.
Sometimes called American chop suey in New England, or simply slum gullion in the Midwest. Goulash was less about tradition and more about invention. The ingredients were flexible but familiar. Elbow macaroni was the backbone, cheap, filling, and able to soak up all the flavors in the pot. Ground beef, when you could get it, provided a bit of protein and richness, but many families stretched it with breadcrumbs, oats, or even a few extra vegetables. Canned tomatoes or tomato sauce were the soul of the dish, giving it a tangy, slightly sweet backbone. A chopped onion, maybe a clove of garlic, salt, pepper, and a dash of paprika, if the cupboard hadn't run dry, rounded things out. The making of goulash was as unpretentious as the meal itself. First, the macaroni was boiled until just tender, then set aside. In a large skillet or pot, the ground beef was browned with chopped onion, its fat rendering out and mingling with the sweet, soft onion. If garlic was on hand, it joined the pan, filling the kitchen with its unmistakable scent. The tomatoes came next, sometimes whole and crushed by hand, sometimes as sauce or paste thinned with water. Everything simmered together until the flavors melded, and then the cooked macaroni was stirred in, soaking up the rich, tomatoey sauce. Some families liked it soupy, others thick and hearty. Either way, it arrived at the table in big, steaming bowls, sometimes topped with a sprinkle of shredded cheese or a dab of sour cream when fortune allowed. It was a dish that satisfied hunger and left room for conversation. a meal that filled both bellies and hearts. Goulash wasn't fancy, but it was deeply loved. It taught families how to transform scraps into sustenance, how to share from a single pot, and how to find joy in the everyday act of cooking and eating together. Dish 23, hominy with bacon. Sometimes the oldest foods on the table carried the deepest roots, and during the Great Depression, hominy was a quiet reminder of resilience stretching back generations. Hominy, a Native American staple made from dried corn kernels treated with lye or lime to remove their hulls, was a common sight in Depression-era kitchens, especially in the South and rural parts of the country. It was cheap, hearty, and versatile, and when paired with a little bacon or salt pork, it became a dish that could carry a family through lean times with dignity and surprising satisfaction. Canned hominy was a pantry regular, though some families, especially in the South, still prepared it the old-fashioned way, soaking and cooking dried corn for hours. Its chewy, nutty texture set it apart from ordinary corn, and its mild flavor made it a perfect companion to the smoky, salty richness of bacon. The preparation was simple but deeply comforting. A skillet was set over the stove, and slices of bacon were laid in, slowly rendering out their fat until crisp and golden. The smell alone was enough to bring children drifting into the kitchen, drawn by that familiar perfume of home. Once the bacon was cooked, it was lifted out and crumbled, leaving behind a shimmering layer of drippings. Into the hot skillet went the drained hominy, its pale kernels crackling as they hit the fat. A quick toss or stir ensured each piece was coated in the flavorful drippings, soaking up all that smoky goodness. Salt and pepper were the usual seasonings, though some cooks added a pinch of red pepper flakes or a dusting of paprika for a little kick. Once the hominy was warmed through and lightly crisped at the edges, the crumbled bacon was scattered back over the top. Served as a side or even a main dish with a slice of cornbread or a biscuit, hominy with bacon was a meal that spoke to endurance and resourcefulness. It filled bellies, brought people to the table, and quietly honored a lineage of cooks who had been making do for centuries before the Depression ever arrived. Hominy reminded families that survival wasn't just about getting through the moment. It was about remembering the wisdom of those who came before and finding comfort in foods that had stood the test of time. Dish 24, rice pudding. When the world outside was hard and uncertain, there was something deeply reassuring about the soft, sweet comfort of rice pudding steaming on the kitchen table. Rice pudding was one of the Great Depression-era desserts, not flashy, not elaborate, but rich with the kind of homey goodness that made a house feel warm even when times were cold. Rice, one of the most affordable and long-lasting staples in the pantry, became the foundation for this dish that stretched across cultures and generations, from farm kitchens to city flats. The beauty of rice pudding was that it didn't require much: a handful of rice, a bit of milk, or evaporated milk, sugar, and a dash of spice if the cupboard allowed. Even in the leanest times, a pot of rice pudding could materialize, a small act of sweetness amid the daily grind of scraping by. To make it, the rice was simmered slowly in milk, sometimes watered down to make it stretch, with sugar stirred in for sweetness. The scent of warm milk, sugar, and rice bubbling together filled the air, a soft perfume that signaled comfort was on its way. A pinch of salt balanced the flavors, and when luck smiled, a sprinkle of cinnamon or nutmeg dusted the top, turning the humble into the extraordinary. Some families stirred in raisins, chopped dates, or even a spoonful of jam to brighten the pot, but many kept it plain, letting the creamy texture and gentle sweetness shine. The rice softened, the milk thickened, and before long, a spoon dragged through the pot left a velvety trail. The pudding was often served warm, ladled into chipped bowls, steam curling up into the cool evening air. Leftovers were a rare luxury, but when they happened, they were spooned cold the next morning as breakfast, a treat that made children race to the table. Rice pudding was more than just a dessert. It was an act of care, a way to end a day on a soft note, no matter how hard the hours before had been. It reminded families that even with little, you could make something that felt like a gift, something sweet, smooth, and kind. Dish 25, molasses cake. In a world short on sugar and luxuries, molasses was the old friend that stayed behind, rich and dark, ready to sweeten even the toughest times. Molasses cake was the Depression-era dessert that spoke of thrift, ingenuity, and the deep, earthy sweetness that sugar alone couldn't match. Where white sugar was often rationed or too expensive, molasses stepped in, bringing not only sweetness, but a depth of flavor that filled kitchens with the scent of something special. For many families, a molasses cake wasn't just a treat, it was a celebration, a small triumph over scarcity. The cake came together from the simplest of ingredients: flour, baking soda, a pinch of salt, a little fat, usually shortening or lard, and, of course, molasses. If an egg or two could be spared, they went in for richness, but the cake held its own without them. A splash of hot water helped loosen the batter, and when times were good, a pinch of spice, ginger, cinnamon, or cloves, might be added, filling the house with a perfume that felt like pure comfort. To make it, the dry ingredients were whisked together in one bowl: flour, soda, salt, and any spices on hand. In another bowl, the molasses was mixed with hot water, melting into a dark, silky syrup. The wet was poured into the dry, the fat stirred in, and everything beaten together until smooth. It was a simple batter, but there was something almost meditative about mixing it. The heavy spoon gliding through the glossy batter, the molasses leaving dark ribbons as it folded in. Poured into a greased pan and baked in a moderate oven, the cake rose with a gentle swell, its top crackling slightly as it set. The smell was unmistakable, warm, spiced, sweet, with that faint, bitter edge that made molasses so beloved. When it emerged from the oven, it was dark and fragrant, its crumb tender and slightly sticky. Molasses cake was often served plain, perhaps dusted with a little powdered sugar if there was any to spare. On special days, it might be topped with a smear of butter or a drizzle of cream. But even without embellishment, it was deeply satisfying. A cake that wrapped around the tongue and the heart, reminding everyone at the table that joy could still be found in the simplest slice. When we look back at the meals that carried families through the Great Depression, we're not just talking about recipes. We're talking about stories, survival, and the stubborn beauty of making something out of almost nothing. These 25 dishes weren't fancy. They weren't polished for cookbooks or staged for glossy magazines. They were born at kitchen tables worn smooth by elbows and hands, in homes where every crumb was counted and every meal was a small victory. And yet, they were more than just food. They were nourishment for body and spirit alike. Imagine the hands that stirred pots of hoover stew, fried up slices of cornmeal mush, or coaxed sweetness out of molasses cake. Imagine the mothers stretching scraps of meat to feed 6 mouths, the fathers bringing home sacks of beans or potatoes with quiet pride, the children racing to the table for a slice of peanut butter bread or a warm bowl of rice pudding. These were meals made with grit, imagination, and love. The Depression-era kitchen was a place of invention. It was where resourcefulness met heart. A simple pot of navy bean soup could bring warmth on a freezing night. A skillet of fried cabbage and noodles could draw smiles from tired faces. Even a plate of onion sandwiches or a pan of eggless pancakes could lift the gloom just a little, reminding families that they still had each other and that sometimes that was enough. And though times have changed, the lessons those dishes carry are timeless. They remind us that good food doesn't have to come from expensive ingredients or complicated techniques. It comes from care, from creativity, from the quiet determination to feed the people you love with whatever you have. They remind us, too, of gratitude, that a warm meal, no matter how humble, is always something to be thankful for. Today, as we stand in grocery aisles filled with abundance, it's easy to forget the days when a simple loaf of peanut butter bread or a bubbling pot of cabbage soup felt like a feast. But perhaps there's something worth reclaiming in those old recipes. The wisdom of waste, not want not, the pleasure of a meal shared, the quiet pride in feeding your family with your own 2 hands. So maybe give one of these dishes a try. Make a pot of macaroni and tomatoes, fry up some potato pancakes, or bake a molasses cake just because. Taste the history in every bite. Remember the families who sat down to these meals and the resilience that kept them going. Because in the end, these aren't just Depression-era recipes. They're love letters from the past, still warm, still waiting, still ready to remind us of what matters most.